France oversaw territory spanning 17 modern-day nations, from Morocco to the Congo. Under the banner of a civilizing mission, France oversaw brutal occupations that engorged the wealth of the empire and left a terrible legacy for ordinary Africans, marked by slavery, extraction, and murder. And today, France's empire in Africa is still around, in a streamlined, more profitable, and even more exploitative form. Let me explain. In the aftermath of the Second World War, there was a wave of decolonial movements sweeping across Africa and Asia. And the French, humiliated by their defeat and occupation at the hands of the Nazis, were eager to maintain their empire. So they responded to revolts in Algeria, Indochina, and Madagascar with brutal reprisals. Maintaining foreign holdings became increasingly difficult. By 1960, France was forced to grant independence to almost all its colonies. But something really important happened in Africa. Basically, the leadership of France decided to keep their empire in Western and Central Africa intact, in everything but name. The plan was simple. When an African country gained its independence, it was made to sign a so-called cooperation agreement with France, which would outline the nature of their relations moving forward. In exchange for French foreign aid, African countries were required to give France rights over natural resources, allow France to maintain troops in their territory indefinitely, and, most importantly, keep these countries' currencies linked to France's currency, the franc. Instead of having their own currency, they were to use the franc of the Financial Community of Africa, what is now called the CFA franc. The French framed these cooperation agreements as a choice, but they were also clear about the consequences of defiance. When the leader of Guinea, a socialist named Sékou Touré, rejected the cooperation agreement with France and declared that he preferred to be poor in freedom than rich in slavery, the French government decided to make an example of him. Look at the Central African country of Gabon as one example. Gabon is particularly important to France because it has a huge supply of oil and an even bigger supply of uranium. Among the African colonies, Gabon was historically one of the very closest to France. In 1967, a man named Omar Bongo became Gabon's president, soon turning the country into a one-party dictatorship. And Bongo was intimate with France. He had been appointed after flying to Paris for what was basically a job interview with the president. So under Bongo, France and Gabon enjoyed a relationship that benefited both sets of elites. Gabon's oil was pumped by the French state-owned oil company ELF, and its uranium went right into France's arsenal of nuclear weapons. In return, France subsidized Gabon's budget, especially the parts that flowed into the pockets of Omar Bongo and his family. At one point, Bongo was worth over $130 million. Gabon, meanwhile, remained poor and underdeveloped. Under Bongo, it had one of the highest infant mortality rates in the world. Instead of investing in the Gabonese economy, Bongo spent state funds on influencing French politics in his favor, bankrolling the campaigns of several future French presidents. Even today, France keeps troops in the country to support Gabon's current ruler, who happens to be Omar Bongo's son. And elites in France get a great deal too. They enjoy cheap access to natural resources and kickbacks from shady business deals. A French billionaire named Vincent Bolloré now owns most of the major ports across West Africa. In France, Bolloré is known as the, quote, king of Africa. So French colonialism in Africa has never really ended. This is why academics use the term neocolonialism. Even as the branding of empire has faded away, the structures of economic extraction have only grown stronger. This neocolonialism is actually a much more efficient form of exploitation than the colonialism of the past. The French no longer pretend to care about building functional governments or improving local living standards. It's pure extraction, all the time. So these African countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited. France is almost totally reliant on its influence in Africa for its economic power. In the words of Italy's foreign minister, if France didn't have its African colonies, because that's what they should be called, it would be the 15th largest world economy. Instead, it's among the first, exactly because of what it's doing in Africa. And the French know this. François Mitterrand, former president of France, said it himself. Without Africa, he declared, France will have no history in the 21st century.
For a continent that is rich in resources, why are we not the most prosperous in the world? Right now, some of you are looking at me like, oh, it is because of their selfish African leaders. And you would be right. Many African countries got their liberation or independence from the French government in the 1960s. But before the French left, they made these countries sign a contract which essentially forced them to pay just for the French to leave the country. Fast forward to 2020, there are now still 14 countries that pay colonial tax to the French. There'll be Benin, Burkina Faso, Senegal, Ivory Coast, Mali, Niger, Congo, Togo, Cameroon, Chad, Guinea-Bissau, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, and the Central Republic of Africa. The French government are essentially stalling the economic development of these countries by forcing them to pay 85% of their foreign reserve into the French central bank. The French hold about $500 billion belonging to these countries. Some of you right now are thinking, how is this possible? But to get a full picture, we need to go back. Due to industrialization, Europe wanted Africa's resources. So in 1885, 14 European countries got together for a meeting called the Berlin Conference, also known as the Scramble for Africa. The major countries were France, Britain, Portugal, and Belgium. They portioned off Africa to make sure that they did not step on each other's toes once they got onto the continent. Britain and France took most of Africa. They came, they massacred, and they stole. And between 1958 and 1961, when the French were leaving Africa, they told their former colonies, they said, listen, now that we're leaving Africa, we need you to sign this document which will allow us to continue colonization over you. And if you don't, not only will you not get your independence, but, well, you saw what we did to you before. It's going to be a lot worse. What does the French colonial tax look like? Well, here's a few points from the document. 85% of your bank reserve will be invested in the French stock market under France's name. All the minerals in your country now belong to France. You're only allowed to use the currency that the French provide to you. France will have military presence in your country. Your military can only be trained by France. And if there's a war, your allegiance is with France. Now, every African leader that has tried to get their country out of this bullshit deal has either been assassinated or removed from presidency or leadership at the behest of the French through military coups or coups d'etat.
Historically, France has maintained a military presence in post-colonial countries in order to maintain their interests. For instance, in Mali, 1961, the first president, Modibo Keïto, gained independence and attempted to relieve the country of French influence. He was overthrown and later killed in jail. Thomas Sankara was famously against French control in Burkina Faso and also the colonial tax. He was later killed in 1960. The very controversial Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi saw a unified Africa through a common currency which would be backed by African gold. The French pushed back against this as it would be valuable enough to outdo the CFA franc, and well, we all know what happened to him. These are all examples of how France have used their military presence to maintain their interests, and there are many more.
General Salif Modi, one of the officers behind the coup in Niger, visited Mali on Wednesday and met with officials from the country. Modi and his delegation attended a meeting with Colonel Assimi Goïta, who seized control over the landlocked West African country nearly 3 years ago. Western countries fear that Niger will fall under Russia's influence after the coup, especially as Mali has welcomed up to 1,000 fighters from the Wagner Group.